When I returned from my business trip, I discovered my son-in-law had remodeled my entire house. My parents will live here with you now. Easier to have all the dead weight under one roof. 1 hour later he was panicking. Why are the police here looking for me? Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My home in Georgetown is a study in quiet, disciplined order. It is a 3-story brick sanctuary, a place where the chaos of Washington, D.C. is held at bay by thick, 100-year-old walls and the gentle ticking rhythm of an antique grandfather clock in the foyer. Every object in this house has a story, a provenance. The worn leather armchair in my study is where my late husband Thomas read the newspaper every single morning for 40 years. The intricate tapestries on the walls are from my time consulting on an international trade deal in Brussels. This house is not just a collection of things, it is the physical archive of a life well lived, a life of hard work, strategic thinking, and the quiet, immense satisfaction of building something that lasts. I am Evelyn Reed, and for most of my professional life, I was the chief financial officer for one of the largest defense contractors in the country. My world was one of numbers, of spreadsheets that stretched into infinity, of billion-dollar budgets where a single misplaced decimal point could mean the difference between a successful project and a national disaster. I am a woman who believes in order, in precision, in the cold, hard, and unforgiving logic of a balance sheet. Now in my retirement, I apply that same logic to my own, much smaller world. I serve on several boards, including the DC Police Foundation, where I chair the audit committee, a role that keeps my mind sharp and my connections to the city's power structure intact. The only chaotic, unpredictable variable in my well-ordered life is my love for my daughter Lena. She is a good woman, with a kind heart, and her father's artistic soul, but she is also soft. She is a quiet, gentle stream in a world that I know to be a raging and often treacherous river, and she is married a hurricane. My son-in-law Marcus Thorne is a man of immense, almost blinding charisma. He is a real estate developer, a man who moves through the world with the slick, confident swagger of a born salesman. He is building his first major project, a luxury hotel, and he speaks of it with a kind of feverish, almost religious ambition. I, a woman who has spent a lifetime analyzing financial projections, have seen his business plan. It is a house of cards, built on a foundation of risky loans and a deeply optimistic, almost delusional belief in his own genius. As I packed my suitcase for a 2-week consulting trip to London, a quiet, persistent unease settled over me. It was a feeling I had learned to trust, a CFO's sixth sense for a hidden liability, for an unaccounted-for risk. I had tried, gently, to express my concerns to Lena about Marcus's finances, about his almost pathological need to project an image of success that was far beyond his actual means. But she, in her gentle, loving, and deeply conflict-avoidant way, had always defended him. "He's a visionary, Mom," she would say. "You just have to trust him." Trust. In my world, trust was not a feeling. It was a commodity, earned through a long and verifiable history of performance. And Marcus Thorne's performance, I feared, was all style and very little substance. As I zipped my suitcase, the final satisfying sound of a task completed, I made a mental note. When I returned from London, it would be time to have a real and likely very difficult conversation with my daughter about the true meaning of the word asset, and the very real danger of the man she had chosen to marry becoming a liability she could no longer afford. While I was settling into my first-class seat, a glass of champagne in my hand, my mind already on the complex financial models I would be reviewing in London, my son-in-law was pacing the floor of his own, very different, world. He and Lena lived in a sleek, minimalist condo in the New Wharf district, a place of glass, steel, and a breathtaking and deeply expensive view of the Potomac. The scene, as it was described to me later by a devastated and deeply ashamed Lena, was one of pure, uncut, and deeply arrogant ambition. Marcus was moving through their stark white living room like a caged panther, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, angry growl. "What do you mean, the permits are delayed?" He was snarling into the phone, his voice echoing in the minimalist space. "I have a construction crew on standby. I have investors breathing down my neck. Do you know who I am? You get those permits approved, or so help me. I will be in the mayor's office tomorrow morning, and your name will be the first one on my list." He slammed the phone down, his handsome face a mask of furious, impotent rage. Lena, my gentle, quiet Lena, was sitting on their white leather sofa, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "What's wrong, honey?" she had asked, her voice a small, timid thing. "What's wrong?" he had shot back, turning on her, his frustration a palpable, toxic cloud in the room. "What's wrong is that I am trying to build an empire in a city that is run by a bunch of timid, bureaucratic old men, This hotel, Lena, it is my masterpiece. It will redefine the skyline of this city, and I am being held up by a piece of paper. He had then walked to the vast floor-to-ceiling window and had stared, not at the river but north towards the old, quiet and deeply historic neighborhood of Georgetown. And your mother, he had said, his voice a low, resentful murmur. She's no better. She's sitting in that museum, that mausoleum of a house, on one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the entire city. And what is she doing with it? She's letting it rot. The plumbing is ancient. The kitchen is a disgrace. She has a fortune, Lena. A real, tangible, and deeply powerful fortune, right there, in that one single property. And she is sitting on it, like a dragon on a hoard of gold, and she is letting it decay. He had turned from the window, his eyes shining with a new and deeply disturbing idea. She has no vision, he had declared. She is stuck in the past, her whole world, that quiet, dusty, dignified world. It's over. The future is about being bold. It's about taking what is old and making it new. It's about tearing down the walls, literally to let the light in. He had looked at Lena, his expression no longer one of anger, but of a kind of messianic and deeply manipulative inspiration. She doesn't see it, he had said, his voice a low conspiratorial purr. But I do. I see the potential, not just for her house but for our future, and I think, he had said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, that it's time I gave her a little push into the 21st century. The plan, when Marcus unveiled it to Lena, was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a brilliant and deeply twisted refraining of a monstrous act of disrespect into a gesture of loving, forward-thinking care. He had sat her down on their white leather sofa. He had taken her hands in his. His voice was no longer the angry, frustrated growl of a thwarted tycoon, but the low, soothing and deeply persuasive murmur of the man she had fallen in love with. Lena, my love, he had begun, his eyes full of a deep and utterly fraudulent sincerity. I have been thinking about your mother, and I am worried about her. He had painted a picture of me as a lonely, frail old woman, rattling around in a vast, empty and rapidly decaying house. He had spoken of the burden of the upkeep, the danger of the old wiring, the inefficiency of the ancient plumbing, and my parents. He had continued, seamlessly weaving his own needs into this narrative of loving concern. They're getting older too. They're living in that small, cramped house out in Maryland. It's a struggle for them, the stairs, the yard work. He had paused, letting the two separate and deeply manipulative threads of his argument hang in the air, and then he had woven them together into a single brilliant and deeply monstrous tapestry. I have had an idea, he had announced, his voice now alight with a creative, problem-solving passion. A way to take care of everyone, a way to bring our family together, to create a real multi-generational home. Your mother is going to be in London for 2 weeks. It's the perfect window of opportunity. He had then laid out his surprise. He was going to hire a crew. While I was away, he was going to completely and secretly gut and remodel the main floor of my historic Georgetown home. He would tear down the unnecessary walls, creating a modern, open-plan living space. He would install a new state-of-the-art kitchen. He would, in his words, transform that dusty, dark old house into a bright, beautiful and functional home for the modern age. And, he had continued, the final brilliant flourish of his plan, we will move my parents in. We'll give them the old master suite. They can sell their house in Maryland, and the money from that can go towards the renovations. It will be perfect. Your mother will have company. My parents will have a beautiful, accessible place to live. And we will have the peace of mind of knowing that our parents are all safe, and comfortable, and together. He had then delivered the final and most chilling line of his pitch, the line that had been the real ugly and deeply selfish heart of his plan all along. It's just so much easier, he had said with a loving, practical smile, to have all the old folks in one place. Lena, my daughter, had been horrified. She had told me later that her first and only instinct had been to scream, "No, you can't. That is her house, her sanctuary. You would be violating the very heart of who she is." But she had not said it. She had looked at her husband, at his handsome, passionate, and deeply, deeply determined face. She had felt the immense gravitational pull of his ambition, of his absolute certainty, and she, my quiet, gentle and deeply conflict-avoidant daughter, had done what she always did. She had surrendered. She had become a passive, and deeply guilty accomplice in the desecration of her own mother's home. The day after my flight departed for London, the invasion began. At 8 a.m. sharp, a fleet of unmarked construction vans had descended upon my quiet, tree-lined street in Georgetown. Marcus was there to greet them, a triumphant, self-appointed general, ready to command his army of demolition. He had unlocked the front door of my home, the home he did not own, and he had ushered them in. The crew, a team of contractors who worked for one of his less reputable business associates, had been given a single clear directive: speed. They were not there to preserve, to restore, or to respect the historic integrity of the 100-year-old house. They were there to gut it. They had worked with a brutal, almost violent efficiency. They had covered my antique furniture, my life's collection of art and books, with thin plastic drop cloths, a flimsy token gesture of respect, before the wholesale destruction began. And then, they had started to tear down the walls. The beautiful solid, plaster and lath walls that had stood for a century, that had absorbed the sounds of a lifetime of family dinners, of children's laughter, of my late husband's quiet, late-night reading. They had come down in a cloud of thick, choking white dust, a cloud of my own history being pulverized into rubble. They had ripped out the original heart pine floors in the living room, the floors that had been worn smooth by the footsteps of 3 generations of my family. They had torn out the beautiful hand-carved marble fireplace mantel, a piece of art that had been in the house since it was built. The kitchen, my kitchen, the warm, slightly cluttered heart of my home, had been the site of the most brutal assault. They had ripped out the beautiful custom-made wooden cabinets, the ones my husband had designed for me himself. They had torn out the old but deeply reliable cast-iron stove. The room had been stripped bare, reduced to a skeleton of exposed pipes and raw, splintered wood. While this was happening, a second front of the invasion was opening. A small, slightly battered moving van had pulled up to the curb, and out of it had stepped Charles and Dolores Thorne, my son-in-law's parents. They were, as I had always known them to be, pleasant, simple, and deeply ordinary people. They were a retired postal worker and a retired school administrator, 2 good people who had raised a monster of ambition and who were now, in their old age, completely dazzled and slightly mystified by the world of wealth and power he inhabited. They were carrying their own moving boxes, their faces full of a quiet, humble, and deeply bewildered gratitude. They were the unsuspecting and deeply innocent pawns in their son's monstrous, disrespectful game. "Isn't this wonderful, Charles?" Dolores had said, her voice a quiet, awestruck whisper, as she had stepped into the chaotic, dust-filled construction site that was now my home. "Marcus is such a good boy to do all of this for us, and for his mother-in-law to bring us all together." They had no idea of the betrayal, of the violation, of the profound and deeply unforgivable act of disrespect that was at the very heart of their son's loving, practical gesture. They were just 2 old people, happy to be taken care of, blissfully unaware that they were the advanced troops in a hostile and deeply unwelcome occupation. My business in London concluded 2 days ahead of schedule. The deal, a complex and deeply satisfying piece of financial restructuring for an old colleague's company, had been a resounding success. I was feeling energized, my mind sharp and clear. The thrill of a problem well solved, a welcome antidote to the quiet, lonely grief of the past year. I decided, on an impulse, to fly home early. I didn't call Lena or Marcus. I wanted to surprise them. I pictured a quiet, happy reunion. I would arrive, unannounced, at their condo. I would take them out to a celebratory dinner. I would be the loving and now slightly less worried mother and mother-in-law. I took a taxi from Dallas directly to my house in Georgetown. I was tired from the long overnight flight, and I just wanted to drop my bags, to have a cup of my own familiar tea, to stand in the quiet, orderly sanctuary of my own home for an hour before I went to see the children. The first sign that something was wrong was the construction dumpster. A massive, industrial-sized metal container sitting on the street right in front of my house, overflowing with what looked like my life. I saw the splintered remains of my kitchen cabinets, the beautiful custom-made ones my husband had designed. I saw the familiar floral print wallpaper from my dining room ripped and torn. I saw the shattered, beautiful and deeply irreplaceable antique tiles from my front entryway. My blood ran cold. My mind, the logical, analytical mind of a CFO, immediately jumped to the most rational conclusion. A fire. A flood. Some terrible, catastrophic accident had occurred while I was away. I paid the taxi driver, my hand trembling as I fumbled with my wallet. I grabbed my suitcase and practically ran up the front walkway. The old heavy oak front door, the one with the original brass lion's head knocker, was gone. In its place was a cheap, flimsy, temporary plywood door with a new, unfamiliar lock. My key, of course, did not work. I began to bang on the door, my heart a frantic, panicked drum against my ribs. "Hello?" I shouted. "Is anyone in there?" After a long, terrible moment, the plywood door creaked open, and a man I had never seen before, a large, dusty man in a paint-spattered t-shirt, looked out at me. "Can I help you, lady?" he asked, his voice a low, unfriendly growl. "This is my house," I said, My own voice, a strange, high-pitched thing I didn't recognize. What is going on here? What has happened? The man just looked at me, a mixture of confusion and pity on his face. You must be the mother-in-law, he said, and then he stepped aside. I walked into my own home, and I froze in the doorway, my heavy rolling suitcase slipping from my numb fingers and thudding to the floor. It was not my house. It was a war zone, a disaster site. The beautiful, elegant, and deeply personal sanctuary I had left 2 weeks ago was gone. The foyer, the living room, the dining room. They were all a single vast and cavernous space of exposed wiring, raw splintered 2x4s, and a thick, choking, and deeply desecrating layer of white dust that covered everything. My furniture, my books, my entire carefully curated life was huddled in the center of the room, draped in ghostly plastic sheets. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and ruin, and from the back of the house I could hear the high whining scream of a power saw. The invasion, it seemed, was still in progress. The sound of the power saw died with a sudden final whine, and from the newly demolished and now cavernous space that had once been my dining room, a figure appeared. It was Marcus. He was not dressed in his usual immaculate suit. He was wearing jeans, a stylish and probably very expensive work shirt, and he had a tool belt slung low on his hips, a costume of a man who works with his hands. He was a real estate developer playing the part of a humble carpenter. He was a vision of fraudulent, masculine competence. He saw me standing in the doorway, amidst the dust and the wreckage of my own life, and his face broke into a wide, triumphant, and deeply, deeply self-satisfied smile. He had been expecting me, of course, but not for another day. My early arrival had just made this moment, his moment of grand visionary revelation, even more perfect. Evelyn, he said, his voice booming with a false hearty bonhomie. He strode across the torn-up floor, his arms open wide, as if to embrace me in a gesture of loving welcome. You're back early. Welcome home. What do you think? I did not move. I did not speak. I just stood there, my suitcase at my feet, and I stared. I stared at the raw, gaping wounds in the walls of my home, at the exposed anatomical ugliness of its construction. I stared at the man who had done this, at my son-in-law, at this smiling, confident, and deeply monstrous vandal who was expecting me to be grateful. He stopped a few feet from me, his arms slowly, awkwardly dropping to his sides as he finally began to register the look on my face. The look was not one of happy surprise. It was not one of grateful tears. It was the look of a CFO who has just discovered a catastrophic and deeply unauthorized 9-figure expenditure on her balance sheet. It was the look of a judge who was about to deliver a sentence. From behind him 2 more figures appeared, a pleasant, simple-looking, and deeply bewildered older couple. His parents, Charles and Dolores Thorne. They were carrying a half-unpacked box of what looked like their own personal knickknacks. They beamed at me, their faces full of a shy, humble, and deeply misplaced joy. Isn't it wonderful, Evelyn? Dolores said, her voice a soft, happy twitter. Our Marcus. He is such a good boy, to think of all of us, together. And then a final figure. My daughter, Lena. She was standing in the background, a ghost at the feast, her face a pale, miserable mask of guilt and shame. She would not meet my eyes. Marcus, seeing that his planned triumphant moment was beginning to go terribly, terribly wrong, decided to push forward, to explain his vision, to sell me on the brilliant, loving logic of his own monstrous act. I know it's a bit of a shock, he began, his voice taking on the smooth, persuasive tone of a salesman closing a difficult deal. But you have to see the big picture, Evelyn. This house, it was dark, it was dated, it was inefficient. I have opened it up, I have made it more modern, more functional. I have brought it into the 21st century. I have increased its value by at least 50%. He gestured with a proud, proprietary sweep of his hand at the chaos, at the ruin. He was so wrapped up in his own arrogant vision that he was completely, utterly blind to the profound and deeply violent violation he had committed. And then, he delivered the final devastating and deeply, deeply arrogant line. The line that was the epitaph of our relationship. The final, unforgivable summary of his own profound lack of respect. He looked from his beaming, innocent parents to me, and he smiled a bright, practical, and utterly chilling smile. My parents will live here with you now, he announced, as if bestowing upon me a great and wonderful gift. I figured it would be easier to have all the dead weight under one roof. Dead weight. The phrase, so casual, so cheerfully dismissive, so profoundly and deeply and unforgivably cruel, hung in the dusty, chaotic air of my ruined home. He was not just talking about his own sweet, simple, and deeply ordinary parents. He was talking about me. We were the dead weight. The old folks. I looked at my daughter, Lena. She was standing in the background, a silent, miserable statue of shame. She had heard it. She had heard her husband, the man she loved, refer to her own mother as dead weight. And she was doing nothing. She was saying nothing. Her silence was her complicity. In that moment, something inside me, the soft, loving and deeply vulnerable part of me that was a mother and a mother-in-law, simply turned to stone. The grief, the shock, the profound personal hurt, it was all still there, a raging chaotic inferno in my chest, but a thick, protective and deeply familiar wall of ice descended over it. The loving mother-in-law vanished, and the chief financial officer, the woman who had spent a lifetime navigating the cold, hard and deeply unforgiving world of numbers and consequences, took her place. My reaction was not what Marcus had expected. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not rage. My face, which I am sure had been a mask of pure horrified shock just moments before, became a thing of absolute and deeply, deeply unnerving calm. I took a slow, deliberate breath, and then I began to do what I do best. I began to conduct an audit. I took a single, calm step into the wreckage of my living room. I looked up at the exposed beams, the dangling wires, the raw, naked skeleton of my home. My mind, the cool, analytical instrument that had once managed billion-dollar budgets, began to calculate. Unauthorized demolition of a load-bearing wall. A clear violation of DC Building Code Section 4, Paragraph 2. Potential fine, $50,000. My gaze swept over the pile of rubble that had once been my fireplace. Destruction of a registered pre-war historical fixture. Violation of Georgetown Historical Preservation Ordinance. Potential fine $100,000 and a mandated period-accurate restoration. I walked my steps slow and deliberate, my expensive travel shoes crunching on the dust and the debris, into the gutted skeletal remains of my kitchen. I looked at the raw, exposed plumbing, the amateurish and almost certainly unpermitted electrical work, multiple flagrant violations of residential safety codes. Work stoppage order from the city is a certainty. Potential for a civil liability lawsuit from the new future owners of the house is significant. I was no longer a homeowner surveying a disaster. I was a CFO, walking through a hostile takeover, cataloging the assets that had been destroyed, and calculating with a cold, precise and deeply satisfying fury, the catastrophic and deeply personal financial liability of the man who was responsible. Marcus was watching me, his triumphant, visionary smile beginning to falter, replaced by a new dawning and deeply confused unease. He had expected tears. He had expected a hysterical, emotional and ultimately manageable old woman. He had not been prepared for this quiet, cold and deeply analytical woman, who was looking at the ruins of her life not with grief but with the cold, hard and deeply calculating eyes of a banker who is about to call in a very, very large loan. After I had completed my silent mental audit of the devastation, after I had calculated a rough but deeply satisfying preliminary estimate of the financial and legal damages, I turned to face my son-in-law. My expression was one of pure calm and utterly unreadable neutrality. The expression of a CEO who is about to make a very difficult but very necessary business decision. I see, I said, and my voice was a quiet, even and deeply chilling thing. You have been very busy. Marcus, who was now thoroughly unnerved by my unnatural calm, forced a tight, brittle laugh. Just trying to add some value, Evelyn, he said, his voice a little too loud in the dusty echoing space. Bringing the place up to modern standards. I see, I repeated. I looked from his nervous smiling face to the bewildered innocent faces of his parents, and then finally to the pale, miserable and deeply guilty face of my own daughter. And then I made my move. If you will all excuse me, I said, my voice a quiet, polite and deeply non-negotiable command. I need to make a phone call. I did not wait for their reply. I turned and walked, with a calm, unhurried and deeply purposeful stride, through the wreckage of my home towards the one single room that they had, in their arrogant and deeply foolish oversight, left untouched, my study. The study was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude. It was a small, quiet, book-lined room at the back of the house, and it was the only space that still looked like my own. I walked inside and I closed the heavy solid oak door behind me. The click of the latch was a satisfying definitive sound, shutting out the chaos, the dust, and the deeply unpleasant presence of my new and very unwelcome house guests. I sat down in my familiar, comfortable leather armchair. I did not look at the family photographs on my desk. I did not allow myself to feel the grief, the rage, the profound personal sense of violation. There would be time for that later. Now was the time for business. I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb moving past the names of my daughter, my friends, my own personal lawyer. This was not a problem that could be solved by a simple domestic legal action. This was not about suing him for damages to my house. That was a small, petty, and deeply unsatisfying form of justice. No. What Marcus had done was not just a violation of my home. It was a violation of a fundamental unspoken law of power. He had mistaken my kindness for weakness. He had mistaken my quiet, understated life for a lack of influence. He had, in his arrogant new money blindness, failed to do his due diligence on the woman whose house he had just so casually and so contemptuously demolished. And now I was going to teach him a lesson. A lesson in the true nature of power in the city of Washington, D.C. A lesson about the quiet, invisible, and deeply interconnected web of influence that truly runs this town. A web that he was not a part of. A web that I, in my quiet, unassuming way, had been helping to spin for the past 20 years. I found the number I was looking for. It was not a lawyer. It was not a contractor. It was the private personal cell phone number of the chief of the DC police. A man I knew not just professionally, from my work on the Police Foundation's board, but personally. A man who had been to my house for dinner. A man who considered me a friend, and a powerful and deeply respected ally. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. Evelyn, his voice, deep, warm, and familiar baritone, said. What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the honor? Frank, I said, and my voice was a quiet blade of ice. I'm afraid this isn't a social call. I'm calling in my capacity as the chair of the Foundation's audit committee. I've just received a credible tip, and I believe we have a serious problem. A problem, Evelyn? Police Chief Frank Patterson's voice on the other end of the line immediately shifted. His warm, friendly tone replaced by a focused professional seriousness. What kind of problem? A financial problem, Frank, I said, my own voice a calm clinical instrument. I was no longer the violated homeowner. I was the chair of the audit committee, a woman whose job it was to be concerned with the financial integrity of the institutions that governed our city. I've received a tip from a source I trust implicitly regarding some significant financial irregularities in a major new development project. The new Luxos Hotel, down by the wharf. The Luxos Hotel, Marcus's project, his masterpiece, his house of cards. The tip, I continued, my voice a low confidential murmur, suggests a pattern of potential fraud, specifically regarding the project's financing, and the legitimacy of some of the permits that were issued by the city's planning commission. There are suggestions of falsified loan applications, of shell corporations being used to obscure the true source of the investment capital, and of, let's call them, undue influence being used to expedite the permitting process. Every word I spoke was a carefully chosen and deeply plausible lie. I had no credible tip. I had only my own CFO's gut instinct that a man who was arrogant and foolish enough to illegally demolish his mother-in-law's house was almost certainly arrogant and foolish enough to be cutting corners in his own deeply over-leveraged business dealings. I was not presenting evidence. I was creating a reason for the evidence to be found. Good God, Evelyn, Frank said, his voice a low, angry growl. The Luxos. That's a $500 million project. A fraud of that magnitude. It would be a major black eye for the city, and for the department, if we were seen to be ignoring it. Exactly, I said. My voice a quiet, and deeply satisfying purr, which is why it needs to be handled with the utmost discretion. A quiet, preliminary investigation. No sirens, no uniformed officers kicking down doors. Just a quiet, professional visit from your best people, the Economic Crimes Unit. Of course, he said immediately. I have just the team, two of my best detectives. They're sharp, they're discreet, and they are absolute sharks when it comes to financial paper trails. Consider it done, Evelyn, and thank you for the tip. You may have just saved the city a great deal of embarrassment. I'm just doing my job, Frank, I said, my voice a masterpiece of civic-minded humility. Protecting the integrity of the institutions we all rely on. I hung up the phone. The die was cast. I had just, with a single quiet and deeply mendacious phone call, unleashed two of the city's most brilliant financial investigators on my son-in-law's fragile and almost certainly fraudulent business empire. I had not mentioned my house. I had not mentioned the illegal demolition. I had not mentioned the dead weight. I had not made it personal. I had made it business. And in doing so I had just transformed a messy domestic dispute into a high-level white-collar criminal investigation. Marcus thought his greatest liability was a tearful, hysterical mother-in-law who was going to sue him for a new kitchen. He had no idea that his real problem, the one that was about to walk through his front door in about an hour, was a pair of quiet, polite, and deeply relentless detectives with a warrant and a very, very strong interest in his creative accounting. He had tried to demolish my house, and I, in return, was about to demolish his entire world. I remained in my study for the next hour, a quiet, still center in the chaotic and now deeply tense storm of my own home. I could hear their muffled voices from the other room, the confused, placating tones of Marcus's parents, the low, angry murmur of my daughter, and the loud, blustering, increasingly nervous voice of my son-in-law, who was clearly trying and failing to reassert his control over a situation that had spun wildly out of his orbit. I did not go out. I let them wait. I let them stew in the juices of their own confusion and dawning fear. I was a spider, and I was waiting, with a profound and deeply satisfying patience, for the fly to feel the first telltale vibrations of the web. At precisely 1 hour after my call to the police chief, I heard Marcus's voice from the other room, a loud and deeply false bellow of authority. "I'll get it," he shouted. He was, no doubt, expecting a pizza delivery, or perhaps another of his bewildered construction workers. I heard his heavy, confident footsteps cross the dusty, torn-up floor of the foyer. I heard the creak of the cheap temporary plywood door as he pulled it open, and then I heard the silence. A new and very different kind of silence. A silence that was filled with the sudden, shocking and deeply unwelcome presence of the law. I stood up from my desk and walked to the door of my study, opening it just a crack so that I had a clear and deeply satisfying view of the scene unfolding in my own private theater of operations. 2 men were standing on my doorstep. They were not in uniform, they were dressed in the quiet, conservative and deeply intimidating uniform of the high-level detective, dark suits, plain ties and the kind of cheap, sensible shoes that are made for walking and for standing. For a very, very long time, their faces were impassive, their eyes sharp, and they radiated an aura of quiet, professional and deeply unimpressed authority. Marcus was just standing there, his hand still on the doorknob, his confident, proprietary smile frozen on his face, slowly dissolving into a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too strained. The taller of the 2 men, a handsome, silver-haired man who I recognized from a police foundation dinner as the head of the Economic Crimes Unit, did not smile. "We're looking for a Mr. Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice a calm, flat and deeply unamused thing. "I'm Marcus Thorne," he said, puffing out his chest, a reflexive act of his usual arrogant self-importance. "What's this about?" The detective's eyes, I noted with a grim professional satisfaction, did not even flicker to the chaotic, demolished state of the house behind him. They were not here for a domestic dispute, they were here for a much bigger and much more interesting fish. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Thorne," the detective said, "down at our office, if you're amenable." It was not, of course, a request. It was a summons, and in the world of men like this, it was a summons that was not to be refused. The quiet, powerful disruption I had set in motion just an hour before had at last arrived at my front door. Marcus's brain, a finely tuned instrument for sales, for charm, for the confident and utter domination of any room he walked into, was simply not equipped to process the scene that was unfolding on his own, newly conquered doorstep. He saw 2 serious-looking men in suits. He saw the grim, official look on their faces, and his mind, in its arrogant, self-absorbed and deeply panicked state, could only arrive at one single and deeply, deeply incorrect conclusion. His confident real estate developer smile, which had already been faltering, now completely collapsed. It was replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed and almost comical disbelief. The smug, triumphant confidence of the man who had just successfully deposed his mother-in-law evaporated in a single heart-stopping moment, replaced by the raw animal terror of a man who has just been caught. He didn't even ask what this was about. He didn't ask to see a warrant. His guilty conscience, a thing he had so successfully and so completely suppressed for the past 2 weeks, now came roaring back to life, and it screamed at him the only possible explanation for the presence of these 2 grim-faced men. The house. His mother-in-law, she had done it. The quiet, frail, and deeply insignificant old woman had somehow in the space of a single hour managed to have him arrested, for remodeling her house. The sheer insane absurdity of it, the profound and deeply insulting disproportionality of the response, was a thing his mind could not fully grasp. But it was the only explanation that made any sense. He turned his head, his eyes wide with a frantic, pleading panic, and he looked, not at the detectives, but at me. I was still standing in the doorway of my study, a silent, watchful and deeply, deeply satisfyingly calm figure, observing the beautiful, chaotic implosion of his world. "Why are the police here looking for me?" he shrieked, his voice a high, ugly and deeply revealing sound. It was not a question, it was an accusation, an admission of guilt, a public and deeply foolish confession that he knew he had done something illegal, and that he was now in his own panicked mind, being called to account for it. His parents, who had been hovering in the background, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern, now looked truly genuinely terrified. The police? Here? For their Marcus? My daughter Lena, who had been a pale, silent ghost of shame for the past hour, now looked as if she were about to faint. The two detectives, I noted with a cool professional admiration, did not even flinch. Their faces remained impassive, their expressions unreadable. They had just been handed a gift, a suspect who was so consumed by his own domestic guilt that he was on the verge of confessing to a crime they hadn't even come here to investigate. It was a rookie mistake, a fool's move, and my son-in-law, for all his ambition, for all his charisma, was at his core a profound and deeply incompetent fool. The lead detective, a man whose name I knew to be Sergeant Reynolds, a veteran of 100 high-stakes, white-collar interrogations, completely and utterly ignored Marcus's hysterical, self-incriminating outburst. He was a shark who had just scented blood in the water, but he was a patient, disciplined shark. He was not here to investigate a messy domestic dispute over a remodeled kitchen. He was here for a much bigger and much more interesting prize. His gaze, which was as cold and as flat as a winter sky, did not even flicker to the chaotic, demolished state of my living room. He looked past the bewildered parents. He looked past the weeping, guilt-ridden daughter, and he fixed his eyes with a kind of quiet, professional intensity on Marcus. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a calm, almost bored and deeply intimidating thing. "We are not here to discuss your domestic arrangements. We are here because you are a person of interest in a financial fraud investigation. An investigation that is being conducted by the DC Economic Crimes Unit." The words, so quiet, so professional, so utterly, completely unexpected, had a profound and beautiful effect. Marcus's frantic, panicked energy, which had been so focused on the house, on me, on his own immediate and deeply personal crisis, simply short-circuited. He just stared at the detective, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending and deeply, deeply satisfying confusion. "Financial fraud?" he stammered, the words a weak, pathetic echo in the dusty, chaotic room. What are you talking about? My finances are perfect." "Are they?" Sergeant Reynolds asked, and he allowed a small, cold and deeply predatory smile to touch his lips. He took a single, deliberate step into the foyer, his partner following silently behind him, effectively blocking Marcus's only route of escape. The interrogation had begun. "Because we have some questions," Reynolds continued, his voice a low, conversational purr, "about your new hotel project, the Luxos. A very ambitious project, a very expensive project. We're interested in your investors, Mr. Thorne, a series of offshore anonymous entities. We're interested in the source of your initial seed capital, and we are particularly interested," he said, his eyes now boring into Marcus's, "in the series of city permits that were so miraculously fast-tracked for your project, despite a number of significant zoning conflicts." He began to ask questions. Sharp, pointed and deeply knowledgeable questions. Questions about shell corporations. Questions about loan applications. Questions about a certain very generous and deeply illegal campaign contribution to a key member of the city's planning commission. And I watched as my son-in-law, the master salesman, the man who could talk his way out of any situation, began to crumble. His confident, easy charm evaporated under the cold, bright and deeply unforgiving light of a real professional interrogation. His answers were weak, they were evasive, they were full of holes. He was a swimmer who had just been thrown into the deep end of the ocean, and he did not know how to swim. He was, and it was a beautiful and deeply satisfying thing to watch, completely and utterly out of his league. The interrogation was not a battle, it was a dissection. Sergeant Reynolds and his partner were two master surgeons, and they were methodically and with a cool professional detachment, taking apart Marcus Thorne's entire fraudulent life, piece by bloody, incriminating piece. It was, as I had suspected, a classic and deeply arrogant house of cards. His entire multi-million-dollar hotel project, the very foundation of his visionary career, was built on a foundation of lies, forgeries, and the illegal use of my own, very good and very powerful name. He had, the detectives revealed, used my name, my reputation as a former CFO of a major corporation, and my position on several powerful city boards, to secure a series of high-risk and deeply questionable loans. He had forged my signature on financial guarantee documents. He had created a fraudulent prospectus for his investors that listed me as a senior non-executive partner in his development firm, a lie that had given his shaky, underfunded project an unearned and deeply illegal air of legitimacy. He had, in short, not just been disrespecting me in my home, He had been actively committing identity theft against me in his professional life, leveraging my 40 years of hard-won integrity as a financial shield for his own reckless and deeply criminal ambition. And as the detectives laid out the cold hard and deeply documented evidence of his crimes, I watched him. I watched the confident, charismatic mask of the visionary developer dissolve, revealing the weak, terrified and deeply pathetic con man beneath. He was a child who had been playing with his father's gun, and he had just very loudly and very publicly shot himself in the foot. Computers and electronic devices related to your business, Thorn Development, LLC. He handed the warrant to Marcus, who took it with a hand that was trembling so badly he could barely hold it. A search warrant, for my house. My quiet, orderly and deeply private sanctuary. He had not just brought his lies, his disrespect, and his violence into my home. He had brought the full, intrusive and deeply humiliating weight of a federal criminal investigation. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new and deeply pathetic emotion. It was not anger, it was not fear. It was a look of pure, unadulterated and deeply, deeply childish pleading. The look of a little boy who has broken a window and is now begging his mother to fix it, to make the consequences go away. But the mother he was looking at was gone. The woman standing in the doorway of the study was a stranger to him. A woman who was not a victim, not an accomplice, but a quiet, powerful and deeply satisfied witness for the prosecution. Throughout the entire brutal and deeply surreal interrogation, my daughter Lena had been a silent, frozen statue of shock. She had stood in the background, her hand clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening comprehension. She was not just witnessing her husband's professional life implode. She was witnessing the demolition of her own, carefully constructed reality. The man she had loved, the charismatic, ambitious, and deeply successful man she had married, was a fiction, a fraud, a common criminal dressed in an expensive suit. The man who had convinced her that her own mother was a relic, a fuddy-duddy, a woman who didn't understand the modern world, was in fact a man who had built his entire modern life on a foundation of his mother-in-law's good name. He had not been succeeding in spite of me, he had been succeeding because of me, because of the name and the reputation he had been secretly and illegally stealing. The spell, the powerful, charismatic spell he had held her under for their entire marriage, was finally and brutally broken. She was looking at her husband, not with the adoring, slightly intimidated eyes of a loving wife, but with the clear, cold and deeply disillusioned eyes of a stranger. The moment of her awakening, the moment she finally chose a side, came when the detectives began their search. They were professional, of course, but their work was by its very nature invasive. They began to go through Marcus's briefcase, through the boxes of his parents' belongings, searching for any financial documents. It was then that Marcus, in a final, pathetic and deeply revealing act of cowardly desperation, had tried to throw her under the bus. "You should check her things too," he had said to Sergeant Reynolds, his voice a low, vicious snarl as he pointed a trembling finger at my daughter. "She's a partner in the firm. She knew everything. Her signature is on half of those loan documents." It was a lie. Of course, he had forged her signature, just as he had forged mine, but in that moment of his own personal ruin, he was willing to drag her down with him. And that was the moment my daughter, my quiet, gentle, and deeply conflict-avoidant daughter finally found her voice. She stepped forward, her back straight, her eyes blazing with a new and deeply unfamiliar fire. "That is a lie," she said, her voice not the soft, hesitant whisper of the woman I knew, but a clear, strong, and utterly unshakable declaration of truth. She turned and looked, not at her husband but at me, and her eyes were full of a profound and deeply, deeply apologetic sorrow. "I was a fool, Mother," she said, her voice cracking with the weight of her own, long overdue confession. "I was a blind, and deeply foolish accomplice to his ambition, but I was not a party to his crimes, and I will not, for one more second, be a party to his lies." She then turned to Sergeant Reynolds. "Detective," she said, her voice now a thing of pure, cold and unshakable resolve. "My husband is a liar, and a thief, and I will be more than happy to give you a full and completely honest statement, to tell you everything I know." The awakening was complete. The passive accomplice was gone. In her place was a new woman, a strong, resolute and deeply, deeply wronged woman, who was at long last ready to choose a side, and she had chosen the side of the truth. She had chosen the side of her mother. The fallout was a swift and deeply satisfying demolition. Marcus was taken downtown for questioning, his confident, arrogant swagger completely gone, replaced by the shuffling, defeated gait of a man who knows the game is up. His professional life, the one he had built on a foundation of my good name and a series of criminal lies, was over. His house of cards had come crashing down. His parents, Charles and Dolores, were left in the middle of my ruined living room. Two bewildered and deeply pathetic figures in a landscape of dust and debris. They were the innocent, if willfully ignorant, casualties of their son's monstrous ambition. The dream of their comfortable, well-cared-for retirement in a beautiful, historic Georgetown home had vanished, replaced by the ugly, humiliating reality of their son's impending indictment. As the detectives were leading Marcus away, Dolores, his mother, had turned to me, her face a mess of tears and confusion. "I don't understand," she had wept. "He's a good boy, he was just trying to provide for his family." I had looked at her, at this sweet, simple woman who had raised a con man, and I had felt not anger but a profound and deeply sorrowful pity. "No, Dolores," I had said, my voice quiet but firm. "He was not providing for his family. He was stealing from mine." And then, my daughter, my new, strong and deeply awakened daughter, had done the thing I had not had the heart to do myself. She had walked over to her in-laws, her expression one of quiet, sorrowful but utterly unshakable resolve. "I think it's time for you to go," she had said, her voice gentle but with an unmistakable edge of steel. "This is not your home. It was never your home. This is my mother's house." And so, they had left. They had gathered their few half-unpacked boxes of knickknacks, and they had shuffled out of my life, two sad little ghosts, their own dreams in ruins. The house, for the first time in 2 weeks, was quiet. The construction crew had been dismissed. The invaders were gone. Lena and I were left alone, standing in the middle of the beautiful and deeply violated wreckage of my home. We did not speak for a long time. There were no words that could bridge the chasm of the past few years. The chasm of her silence, of her complicity. Finally she had turned to me, her eyes full of a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence. "I am so sorry, Mom," she had whispered, the words a raw, broken and deeply, deeply honest thing. "For all of it. For my silence. For my weakness. I was a coward. And I let him hurt you. I will never ever forgive myself for that." I had just looked at her, at my beautiful, broken and finally awakened daughter, and I had known in that moment that our own personal reconstruction, the slow, difficult and deeply necessary work of rebuilding our own broken foundation, was just about to begin. The week that followed was one of quiet, methodical and deeply satisfying deconstruction. Marcus, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, had been indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. His face was on the cover of the Washington Post business section, not as a visionary developer, but as a common white-collar criminal. His ruin was absolute. Lena, true to her word, had left him. She had filed for divorce, her action swift, clean and decisive. She had moved back into her childhood bedroom in my house. A 36-year-old woman starting her life over from scratch, in the middle of a literal and metaphorical construction site, and we had begun the work of rebuilding. I had called my own, trusted and deeply respectful contractors. They had surveyed the damage Marcus had wrought, shaking their heads in a mixture of professional disgust and quiet awe at the sheer arrogant stupidity of it all. The work to restore my home, they had told me, would be long and expensive, but it was possible. The first few days, Lena was a ghost in her own home. She was quiet. She was withdrawn. She was processing the full, catastrophic scope of her husband's betrayal, and of her own passive complicity in it. She helped the cleaning crews. She sorted through the dusty, plastic-draped furniture, her movements slow and penitent. And then, on the 7th day, something shifted. I was in my study, the one room that had been spared the demolition. I was not looking at the old, historic blueprints of my own home. I was looking at a different set of documents, the full, detailed and deeply fraudulent financial statements from Marcus's now defunct company which my lawyers had provided me. I was dissecting them, my old CFO's mind finding a grim professional satisfaction in tracing the web of his lies, in understanding the full, ugly and ultimately pathetic architecture of his deception. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Lena. She stood in the doorway, her expression no longer one of shame, but of a new, quiet and deeply serious resolve. "Mom," she began, her voice a little hesitant but clear and strong. Can I ask you something?" "Of course, darling," I said, looking up from the papers. She walked into the room and stood before my desk. She did not ask about Marcus. She did not ask about the divorce. She did not ask about her own uncertain future. She looked at the complex, multi-layered financial statements spread across my desk, at the world of numbers, of assets and liabilities, the world that I had commanded for so long, and that she had never, not once, shown any interest in. And she asked me a question that was not about our family, but about our future. "Show me," she said, her voice a quiet, humble and deeply, deeply sincere request. "Show me how you did it. Not just the house, all of it. The business, the boards, the power. Show me how you built your world. I looked at my daughter, my quiet, artistic and deeply gentle daughter, and I saw in her eyes a new fire, a fire that had been ignited in the wreckage of her old life. She was no longer a passive accomplice, she was a woman who was, at long last, ready to learn how to build something of her own. A slow, genuine and deeply hopeful smile spread across my face. I pushed aside the fraudulent blueprints of my son-in-law's ruined empire, and I pulled a clean, fresh sheet of paper towards me. "All right, Lena," I said, my voice full of a quiet and deeply satisfying pride. "Let's get to work. Let's draw up a new blueprint." The end. Thank you for watching.